Welcome back to Artificiality. Thanks for joining us again. We are excited to have Christine Rosen on the pod today. So Christine is a senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on American history, society and culture, technology and culture, and feminism. She previously was editor of Character, managing editor of Weekly Standard. She has a very long list of publications in a variety of magazines and newspapers and books. It's way too long to list, so please go to her bio on aei.org to learn all of the details. But we had her on to talk about specifically one book.
Yeah. So her most recent book is The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. This is an absolutely fabulous book. Not many people can write from a position of personal experience and then knit it so beautifully into a commentary on technology and on technology as embedded in human systems. I learned so many fascinating things that I never knew about, including things like people being unable to write cursive means that you're unable to read cursive, which means that good luck the next generation trying to read the Articles of Confederation, I think is how it basically, that's the short story. But it's just a spectacular read about what we risk losing by becoming overly cognitive and overly technology, overly reliant on AI in particular and technology in general. But it is, and also if you want to buy a book purely for its cover, I would also recommend it on that basis too. But it's a wonderful discussion, and there's a nice little story that comes out about what inspired me to reach out to Christine, because she is she is such a public figure that I didn't know if she would answer my email. So instead of sending her an email, I wrote her a letter, an old-fashioned letter, and I put it in the post. And I got a wonderful reply saying, "How could I ignore a handwritten letter?"
And I'm gonna share with the audience something that's very particular about you that is very analog. And so, if you're looking at this on video, you can see the little stickies throughout the book, and this is a way to understand what Helen finds is interesting in a book. She doesn't capture it digitally or write it down anywhere. She actually uses little actual stickies here, and she does this also because she wants to preserve the book and actually not writing it. I've gotten in trouble for like underlining things in books, and she
can't do that.
Yeah, but she does. But this is also shows the level of involvement and respect in Christine's work when you see these books. So when she holds up a book, next time look at the side and just see how many stickies.
And the ones that stick out broader, those are the ones where there's a particular quote that I want to go and actually write down somewhere else. So there's a system.
There's an analog system.
Yeah, it's a very legal.
All right, so enough chattering about us. Thank you so much to Christine for joining us. Stick around. I think you'll really enjoy this interview with Christine Rosen. Christine, thanks so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with our opening question. In particular for this book, I find it very interesting, which is what inspired you to write this book?
So I had, for more than 20 years, I've been studying technology's impact on human behavior. Pre-Facebook, I started out in the MySpace days, if anyone remembers MySpace. But over the years, I was noticing not just large trends and concerns about how technology was changing democracy and information processing, all this stuff, but just very quotidian things, how it was changing the way we interacted on a daily basis. What happened when we bumped into each other when everyone had a cell phone in their face? And these seem like minor things, and the kind of behavior that we're always told we'll adjust to, when something new comes along. But it struck me that there were really some dramatic changes happening and we weren't acknowledging them. Then I stumbled across Robert Michael Pyle's essay about the natural world and about what he called nature deficit disorder, where he used this phrase, the extinction of experience. And he was talking about how when something goes extinct, like a species or an ecosystem, if you're raised in a world where you have no contact with that thing, do you even care that it disappears? And for some reason, it just really stayed with me, this idea that there were experiences that we might be setting aside without thinking about them, but that we might later realize had value and meaning and purpose. And we'd given them up without really much thought because we hadn't really understood those experiences as being uniquely human and important and meaningful. So that was the spark. And I just started jotting down notes when I noticed something, because I am the hybrid generation. I'm Gen X. So I grew up without a lot of these personal technologies and had to adapt to them as an adult. And I was raising my own kids, and I just started keeping a notebook. And that notebook grew to 2, 3, 4 notebooks worth of just stuff. And in a very quantitatively oriented world that we live in, where if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter, I noticed that most of the things in that book were qualitative things, observations about the quality of experiences. And so that's really what started me down this path of writing a book-length treatment of those.
I mean, I think the way you described that is exactly how I kind of perceived it, in the sense of we need to be thoughtful and to document these things that we might lose without really knowing how much we value them. And I took out of that this almost platform for how we should either think about preserving them as is, in the way that they should be, in the way that they originally come to us, but also different ways to think about how they might be preserved in other ways in the future that we can't conceive of with technology. So not sort of an either or. So what I loved about the book particularly was you seem to have crafted something that is not overly nostalgic at all. It's not nostalgic. It's practical without being dry. It's actually it's sort of a beautiful read, if you like, because it brings out all of these different ways. One of the things that really struck me was this framing up front that you had that seemed very simple but very, very, profound, which is that all our experiences are now so mediated. And this idea of a mediated experience for everything is a really powerful way of just simply understanding what's changed so much. How did you come to this idea of mediation, and how did you use that as a sort of lens?
So I think we tend as human beings to think in these broad terms. We'll get statistics. So we've all read, I'm sure, these averages. We spend on average 7 hours a day staring at some sort of screen. And you'll read that and go, wow, that seems like a lot. Gee, okay. And then you move on to the next thing. I think what struck me was how often I would hear myself and my friends and family describing information about something they had seen rather than I did this thing. So they would say, oh, I saw this thing on YouTube. This guy did this, and then he did that. Or I watched this video, or, my friend sent me this Instagram reel and people were doing this. And it just suddenly, as soon as I started noticing it, I saw it everywhere. I saw it in my own life in a lot of places where I was gleaning vast amounts of information about experience, but the amount of time I was having direct experience was shrinking all year after year. And it wasn't by design, and it wasn't because the technology companies are trying to control our brains or any of these sort of scary dystopian schemes. It was a matter of small incremental choices that I was making throughout my day, and then I noticed other people doing as well. And there's a collective impact, though. And that collective impact is that the more we spend time in mediated space, the less time we spend practicing the skills of being face-to-face, of being around other people in public space, of even noticing other people in public space. So for me, again, those are qualitative differences in experience. It's not that we don't have real emotional connection when we have those connections online. We do. I have friends who live on the other side of the world. I love seeing their faces on FaceTime and talking to them. That's much better than a phone call, certainly better than a text or email. But what would be best would be to actually be able to see them in person. So when I have that opportunity, I seize it. And I think understanding that you can like both things, but one is qualitatively different from the other. That's the distinction that I think we now have to actively remember and choose, because the easier is always the default, always the mediated.
How do you address this question I'm just sort of struck here thinking, okay, Gen Xers here having this conversation. It sounds like, I'm sort of waiting for the kids to come around the corner and say, oh, you're just being nostalgic and you just don't really get it, and sort of this sort of rejection. I'm curious how you respond to that kind of comment. I mean, I'm very much with you on this, but I'm just trying to figure out how you respond to that sort of, feedback you'd get especially from a younger audience.
I get that all the time. I have two 18-year-old boys, and I've heard that for many years, and the eye roll and the oh brother, and so I think there's a sensibility, and Americans have it almost more than any other group because we're very techno-positivist. We're very oriented on the future and on progress, and we're a young country compared to others. So there's this sense of saying every new thing is good. It's an improvement. It's progress. And that I disagree with because I think every new thing isn't necessarily an improvement. We want it to be, and that's often the intention. And I think if you look back to the early days of Facebook and other early social media platforms, I think some of those guys really did think they were going to bring the world together into a massive group hug where everyone would hash out their differences online and it would be a whole new world. That did not work out. I think in part because their understanding of human nature was too simplistic and too focused on control and attention and capturing attention rather than understanding the nuances of how humans behave, both for good and for ill. So when it comes to that question, I tend to say, well, what is better? What are the things that have made your life better? I can list a bunch of things. I use GPS whenever I'm in a new place on the road because I get lost easily. I grew up in Florida. It was perfectly flat. I have very poor sense of direction. But because I grew up also being forced to read maps because we didn't have GPS, I can do that too. So when I made my sons learn how to read maps, because I think that's a life skill. Just like I think handwriting is something that I don't have to use it every day, but I understand that embodied cognition means it does something for me that using a touch screen or typing or texting doesn't. So I try to practice that. So my answer to the young people who say, oh, you're just old woman shouting at clouds, you have to adjust. I say, yes, to some point I have adjusted and I will continue to do that. But before I adjust, I make sure I understand what I'm choosing. I don't just blindly adopt the new thing, assuming it's for the better, because we know history teaches us that's not always the case with technology. That in fact, once you adopt something and it becomes ubiquitous, it's very difficult to roll it back. And it's very difficult to reclaim some of the social norms and values that we had before that thing took over. And the unintended consequences of powerful technologies, there is a vast history about that. And there are often things you never could predict. The fact that you won't find a child with Down syndrome in most developed Western countries any longer, not because there was a eugenic policy against them, but because once you could test for it, the pressure for parents to do that was immense. And the social norms shifted so that people started to think of themselves as irresponsible if they didn't take the test, irresponsible if they brought a child into the world who had this condition. All of this was happening while, we were doubling the lifespan of people born with Downs through other medical advances. So again, here was an unintended consequence of a technology at scale used by people with themselves having good intentions. So when the new thing comes along, I'm happy to embrace it if I've asked a whole series of questions about how it's going to transform the things that I most value in my community and in my family life.
I think there's also something interesting of putting your work in this a broader amorphous field of scholarship that I'm going to try to define a little bit, which is trying to understand, in this case, you're talking about the value of things like handwriting, because we hadn't really looked at that much before because there wasn't an option to not.
Exactly.
Right? There wasn't an option to not have face-to-face contact. So there's sort of scholarship sort of lags in terms of understanding the value of what we're displacing, but there is no historical yet necessarily. Some of these maybe yes, no, but there's a whole bunch of things that we're learning because we're now living in a mediated world, right? So now we're looking back, going, what was the value of that in some other time frame, in some other way? If I could, I'm curious to ask. Specifically about handwriting. And so if you can give our listeners sort of your sort of description and pitch around handwriting, just to put that into the context for everyone.
Sure. So like many of us of a certain age, I grew up being taught first to write print letters and then cursive. And the cursive handwriting was intense. It was very difficult. I happened to be left-handed. It was even more difficult for me having to learn how to not smudge everything I wrote. But I loved it, like the discipline of it, the fact that it forces you to slow down, and it is a perfect example of embodied cognition, by which I mean your physical body and your mind are acting together in concert to do this very difficult thing. And as it turns out, as keyboards, first with typing. So in high school, a lot of us learned how to type, when typewriters were still a thing. For people under the age of 30, you can Google what a typewriter was like. But for the rest of us, then computers came, and very quickly, a lot of, especially in K through 12 education, a lot of teachers thought, well, now what's the value of cursive? As long as people can read and write print block letters, then we should focus on the keyboarding, because that's the future. That's what's important for kids to know how to do. And so at that time, my children actually were in elementary school when that shift was happening, and they started lowering the amount of time they spent teaching handwriting. And I thought, like many people, that makes sense. It's a practical and efficient way to adjust to new circumstances. But I wasn't entirely sure. And I had one left-hander, one right-hander. They're twins, so they're the same age. And watching each of them struggle with handwriting got me curious about what it meant. So I started looking at some of the neuroscience research. Handwriting isn't just about putting print to paper and learning what the letters are and how to string them together. It's implicated in so many other things, in your working memory, in short and long-term memory, in ability to process, difficult literacy skills, all from learning how to put pen to paper. So it wasn't as simple as we're replacing one tool for communication with a more efficient modern one. We were also taking away all of these things that would improve children's memories, improve their ability to have this embodied cognitive experience. Most importantly, we were taking away one of the few things that forced them to slow down. The pace of writing is always slower than keyboarding or touch screen or any of the other tools our technologies offer. And that's a hugely important skill and benefit for children in particular. They have to tame their physical bodies while disciplining their minds in order to learn to write the word cat. And it seems very small, but in fact, it has all of these downstream effects for their growth and development, both physically and intellectually. So once I realized that, I became a crusader for handwriting, which is ironic because although I was a great letter writer when I was younger, because as you mentioned, there was no alternative to it. We didn't even have a typewriter at home. So if you wanted to get a letter to your friend from camp, you had to write it and mail it. I don't write many letters anymore. I tend to use email and text and, phone calls. So it's ironic that I've become a champion of it, but I think as a life skill, it's important. And then there are all these squishy qualitative things, like the fact that our nation's founding documents are written in cursive, and most children today can't read our founding documents in their original form. And there is something disturbing about they can't sign their names in cursive. Most of them use printer block letters. They can't read, one of the stories I tell in the book is that there was a very fancy cake shop that was desperate to find people who could do piping with icing, write happy birthday in script rather than block letters. The National Archives here where I live recently put out a job notice, and one of the qualifications was that you had to read and write in cursive, because so much of what they do is documenting these old papers that are all in cursive. So that just strikes me as something that we cast away too quickly without really thinking through what the benefits are. And now we have an opportunity to reclaim it. And there are schools bringing cursive writing back. There are people people who grew up not being taught much with cursive handwriting, now doing it, learning, teaching themselves as adults how to do this. So I think that shows that we are capable of adjusting when the pendulum has gone too far in one direction with technology to bring it back to a place where we can still value the old thing and understand its importance while using the new tool for the thing that only it can do. I don't want to write a cursive. When I want to say okay to my friend via text message, it would make no sense to sit down and write that in cursive. So now we have the best of both worlds, but only if we don't abandon what came before and understand its value.
Was it 2024, one of my sort of New Year's things, which I don't generally do, but I bought some calligraphy books and pens to learn how to teach myself how to do this. And whoa, it's hard. Like it's hard. You have to really, your level of attention is profoundly different when you're doing this fine motor coordination on a piece of paper. And I've just found it extremely difficult to get any kind of fluency. So there was this need to almost bust through a frustration layer as well that doesn't necessarily sort of happen digitally. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's and so I'd love to go to the sort of the next part of the story around face to face and being embodied with other people. You point out that can be pretty uncomfortable for lots of different reasons. People maybe don't smell how you want them to smell, or whatever. I mean, she said it, not me.
I take the bus a lot, so
yeah. Oh, no, you smell nice. You smell nice, dear.
Thank you for telling me the world.
But there was one thing that particularly struck me, which was kind of bleeding into some of the emotion side of it. But if we lean too much on having technology tell us how other people are feeling and lose the ability to understand and to read people in that not in that synchronous context. So there were sort of three concepts: the ability to be face to face and to be comfortable with face to face and to know what that means and how it's different in an unmediated situation. The emotional side of that: how do you start to what would we lose by not being able to read people's emotions? And then this other one that I thought was that I haven't seen discussed much at all, which is more about how do we handle mediation that's always, that leans asynchronous, and then we have to do things in a synchronous frame. So I know there's a lot in there, but I thought that those three together spoke kind of in a really complete way about being deliberate about what we value in these face-to-face interactions.
One common thread among all of those themes is the fact that we actually do want friction and a little pushback in the real world in our relationships with each other. And that is in opposition to the values of technologists who want seamless, efficient, convenient, ease of use, right? Ease of use is fantastic when you're talking about your dishwasher. It is not good when you're talking about relationships with other human beings, because those aren't easy. They're not supposed to be. And part of becoming a fully developed person is learning what that means. And the best classroom for that is practicing by being around other people. And so that's where you see I train a lot of younger people in my work, and they are very anxious about just simply having a conversation face to face with another person, because they spend most of their time having some control, false sense of control, I would argue, by having that mediating screen between themselves and others, being able to just close down a conversation, shut it down, go to the next thing. You can't do that in real life. In real life, the person's still standing there going, well, what's your answer? And you're nervous and awkward. And part of becoming a fully grown person, a fully developed person, is recognizing, okay, I'm a little anxious about answering that, but I have to think about it. Let me take a minute and give a response. These are all skills, and we have to practice them. So it is not the same thing to be able to do that with a screen between you. We learned this lesson quite harshly with when everybody took everything online to Zoom during the pandemic. Suddenly it was... I had longtime colleagues who would behave in Zoom meetings, and I'd be like, well, that's a little offensive, isn't it? What did he mean by that? But in fact, actually, if we'd been in person, I would have known he was trying to be sarcastically funny and failing, and I would have been very forgiving of him. So these are all, we are actually wired to communicate in this way. We are wired to read each other's faces and our hand gestures and our bodily movements. When you flatten those out on a screen, you still see the face, but there are some slight alterations with reading it. And there are lots of studies about how much easier it is for people to lie and dissemble on a screen versus face to face, tone of voice, and other sorts of ways of processing emotion. One of the things that really struck me, though, is that by being in each other's presence, we also learn to identify our own emotions and our own feelings better. So sometimes those are going to be uncomfortable, and When you can do things through a screen, you can escape that sense of discomfort immediately. You can turn it off, turn off the conversation. You can switch to something else and have your attention directed elsewhere. When you're sitting in person with another human being and you're both angry or you're both upset or sad, you have to kind of deal with it. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And so I feel like much of our escape mechanism with the screen is preventing us from deepening our connections to each other in that way. And identifying our own emotions and being able to understand the emotions of others is exactly what we try to teach children, right? When you're like, are you angry? Are you hungry? Are you sad? It's also why we have to slow down to do that. It's why when they're naughty, they have to sit still for a minute and just get control of their physical and emotional sensibility. But I feel like as adults, we're going in the wrong direction that way too. Instead of sitting and being with our feelings, even our negative feelings, we flee. We flee by picking up a screen and doing something else. And it's bad for us. I think it's generally bad for us to do that.
It just struck me how much of, that mediated screen experience just encourages sort of fight or flight. And it almost feels like sort of peak humans at the moment are around about 7 years old. They've got this sweet spot. They've been taught enough about how to handle other people, but they haven't had access to a phone yet. There's just a wonderful paragraph in here that I want to sort of pick out, because it speaks to, and it's got two parts to it, because you finish the paragraph with these metaphors that sit on the keyboard, but it really kind of counts to sort of start the paragraph. Technology companies treat our emotions like the law used to treat wives, as property, a kind of digital coverture. But the things technology encourages, efficiency, predictability, repeatability, are not the things we necessarily value in our emotional lives. Our technologies monitor our emotions ostensibly to give us greater control over them, but this is part of a larger shift in the way we're choosing to see the world and live in it, more like machines. Your computer keyboard is a guide to this way of understanding our feelings. There's always a control button. We issue commands. We can delete what we no longer want. We escape when we mess up. We always have an option. I just love that paragraph. I mean, it's so rich. There's so much going on there. And it made me sort of, after I finished it, I sat there for a minute and thought, oh, next time I'm feeling uncomfortable in a face-to-face situation, which is probably going to be with this guy, I'm going to imagine that I have a keyboard in front of me, and what am I leaning on here? How has it changed the way that I approach this?
I'm going to watch you. Your fingers are going to start tapping, and you're going to be trying to figure out.
Well, I'm sitting there going, oh yeah, where's my control button? I'm going to issue some commands here. But I mean, there's just this genius paragraph. I mean, really, it's just those two things. This idea that to frame it as being like wives used to be, thankfully. It's not here, but then flipping it around and having these metaphor. I mean, there's just so much richness there, and I sort of keep pulling these threads. Like I can't let go of that. It's very in my mind now when I'm considering an uncomfortable situation. It's given me different ways to reflect on why escape to the phone, or why escape to an asynchronous mediated experience. What am I fight or flighting from? What's this lizard brain of mine, as it were? I hate that thing, but you know what I mean? That more kind of deeply ingrained, I have to get out of here versus I've got to fight this. How much is that has been sort of, I'm now primed for it on the screen, as opposed to just allowing it to be and to sit in it and to turn on curiosity and problem solving as an antidote to that. It almost sort of reframes what the antidote is to the screen.
Yes, and this is actually a somewhat new thing because of the intimacy of our technologies. I think even when most computers were desktop, and maybe even early laptop era computers, it still felt like a tool, right? An extension of what we could do otherwise. Sort of like eyeglasses allow us to see better. But our new technologies, which not just the smartphone, but a lot of the wearable sensor technology that's the future of much of this, is much more demanding that we conform to its architecture. We are becoming more machine-like. And that struck me that it's fine if you want to turn people into worker bees in an office setting, I guess. I still have problems with the kind of surveillance and monitoring that goes on in among a lot of employers and employees. But at least there's an argument for that, productivity, right? But in our intimate and private lives, there's no argument for that. We're not supposed to be productive in our relationships. And yet the technology is designed in such a way that it habituates us to this idea that we should be productive and efficient all the time. And again, I'm not sure it was intended to do that, but it's certainly having that impact on how we think about things that are by their nature inefficient, full of friction, certainly not always convenient. And that's where I worry about human beings, because of the time we spend with these mediating devices, that we start to become more like the machines rather than creating machines that help us and are just extensions and tools. You can use these in that way. It is possible to do that, but it is a huge challenge because they are not designed to let you do that. They are designed to grab your eye to the screen the minute you get a notification, to have tons of notifications from various apps and platforms. You have to actively dismantle the architecture of the machine and grayscale your smartphone screen, or get a dumb phone. Those are your options if you actually don't want to find yourself sucked into that architecture, because they understand how humans behave, the people who designed these platforms. So in that sense, it's reversed the challenge of being human, because the default is now to be more machine-like, to be more efficient, convenient, seamless, instantaneous. And again, that's great if I want my food delivery order to arrive quickly. It is really bad if my son is struggling with a problem and I need to just sit and be with him and listen and be patient. So yeah, that's all of the ways in which our devices change our behavior and expectations for each other. That's, to me, the most fascinating part of our developing relationship with technology as human beings. And I would argue in a lot of ways we're going in the wrong direction with that. We're in a very dysfunctional and unhealthy or toxic relationship, as the kids say these days, with some of our technologies.
Yeah, you're touching on a couple of our key themes. So first, in terms of these technologies as tools, right? So we draw a distinction between tools of the past, and we use the metaphor that Steve Jobs used, that the computer was going to be a bicycle for the mind, right? So it's a tool that when you use it, it has the same sort of efficiency gains for the mind as it does for the body, right? And that is, or as a bicycle did for the body, right? So, and that's true, right? But now we're moving to these things where these machines are thinking machines to some, depending on how you want to, anthropomorphize and use that word. But now they're becoming minds for our minds. But what's interesting is you're talking about the risk of that kind of flipping, that the machines become the riders and we become the bike, right? Because we're needed for some level of task completion,
right?
And as we think ahead to very sort of advanced AI systems that are making decisions and trying to have agency and take action, they're going to need a human to go push the button, or do something, pull the lever or some sort of physical thing. But suddenly we become the tool. I'm going to chew on that one for a little bit.
Well,
but yeah. the other one that I don't want to drop, though, is talking about intimacy, because and I'm curious how you think about this. There's a couple things that you said that are sort of interesting in this move towards more generative AI, and especially the way that they're implemented today as conversational tools. Mm-hmm. So we are in two different things that are going on in this conversation. One is that they're developing a much more intimate understanding of ourselves, because it's not just what we click at, what we scroll through, what we that sort of user data, but we're actually expressing ourselves. We're sharing things about ourselves that we've never shared with a machine before. We've never said, well, I want to be able to, this is, you're expressing all of these things that are important. The second part, and I'm sorry to layer too many things in one question, but I kind of want to jumble it together, is that when you're talking about the loss of handwriting and moving towards keyboards, I'm curious how you would put that loss of keyboards and writing into just using voice, right? So we're writing and crafting and thinking about the paragraph. We're just kind of saying it. And for me as an extrovert, where I say things and then I have to go back and realize whether I liked what I said, like that's a totally different way of expressing. Because when I'm writing, I write it out and then I go back and I look at it and I edit it. Whereas this, sometimes I just sort of prattle on, as you can tell. But you're doing all of that in this context of intense intimacy. And I'm going to just sort of throw that jumble of ideas back at you to sort of see, what does this mean when we move to conversation and we move to very intimate conversations? What are we both gaining and what are we losing?
So it's fascinating because one thing that struck me about what you just described is that in a weird way, we are moving back towards a more oral and visual culture. Right, we consume more orally and visually than by writing. And I remember when text messaging first became very popular, there were desperate literature professors going, "Well, at least they're writing something. It's BRB and IRL, but it's writing." And there was this desperation to sort of hang on to this thing that they understood intuitively to have value, but they couldn't quite articulate in a world that doesn't measure the value of that thing. So to that end, I would say, the concern for me becomes when we start to outsource to the machine and trust the machine's judgment of what it gathers about us and sends back a report to us more than we trust our own judgment. And our judgment is painfully slow in developing. It's why childhood for humans is so long. It is difficult. It doesn't always work. We're very glitchy. We're unpredictable. We lie to ourselves. Self-delusion is huge among humans and non-existent among AI. And so I think there's a comforting illusion that if we could have a conversation with the machine, it's more private. It's not a human who could tell someone else about it. It's actually, people describe this, having these AI chatbot friends and having it be really comforting to them that it's not a human. That to me speaks to the fact that we've already come so far along this line of conforming to the demands of the machine that it would seem better than a human. That to me is tragic, because as I always tell my friends who have their AI chatbot friends, I'm like, okay, but when you get sick, I'm the one who comes to your house with chicken noodle soup and says, "Are you okay?" And I'll walk your dog. Because we have obligations to each other as humans that cannot be transformed into, however sophisticated and intimate a program for understanding us might be. We live in a physical world. Our physicality means that we still need other people like us to help us. And when I jokingly say, well, when we're all in the human zoo that AI puts us in, we'll be able to go back to the old ways again. But I'm only half joking, because I think we don't want to get to a point where, however useful these AI tools, and they can be incredibly useful for people, they shouldn't replace human interaction. And we're already seeing a kind of two-tier society with therapy, for example, where people whose health insurance isn't as great, they get the AI chatbot therapist, the Wobot or whatever, talking to them. And it's not that it's not helpful. It might be. But for serious mental illness and for people who need to be seen by another human being to be fully understood as a full person, that's not enough. And yet that's what they'll get. And we'll all pat ourselves in the back and say, look at this amazing thing we improved. More people will get care. Yes, but what's the quality of care? And those are the human obligations that I think, just as we shouldn't outsource our understanding of emotion to an Oura ring that says, "Oh, you seem stressed," we should understand those signs in ourselves, because that's what being a fully developed person means. We can't outsource those obligations to machines. Machines should be aiding us in helping fulfill our human obligations. And I feel we're teetering over into, these are serviceable replacements for inconvenient or lazy humans who don't always show up for their shift. And that worries me, because that's a conception of humanity that I don't understand. But you do see its tone in Silicon Valley quite a lot. I'm always amazed by how often I hear the word human coming up now. We didn't used to have to use that word at all much. It was a given. It's not a given anymore. We have to distinguish ourselves from what these powerful things we're creating, and to recognize that they are qualitatively different things that shouldn't always be deployed as substitutes for the human. I love that there's an AI that can detect cancer in radiology scans, working with a radiologist. That is incredible. That's what I think those tools are for, to expand humanity's ability to do the things that we need to do to heal and to improve people's lives. I don't want an AI as a replacement for a human therapist for a kid who's struggling with serious depression. I don't think that's a useful way to deploy these tools. So I know I didn't quite answer your question, but it's more the outsourcing of the human responsibility and the human obligation. We're exchanging that for convenience and power, and we're accepting as substitutes things that really aren't substitutable about being a human being.
One of the kind of ground truths that we've held on to for a long time about, in this general category of what does it mean to be human, because this is constantly this moving frontier, right? And it's getting a little bit of a both and to it. Yes, machines can be creative. Does that mean that humans aren't? And we're not thinking about that. We're thinking about both being creative. One of the ground truths has been that we will look to others for accountability, and we feel responsibility to others and accountability to others, that ground truth holds. I've been recently more concerned about how that is starting to in itself be eroded because of this idea of the inequality you just spoke of. I think Mark Andreessen talks about it as the reality privileged and the reality deprived. That framing, I think, is extremely dangerous, because the reality deprived don't have the ultimate goal of that is to, make the people who are reality deprived because they don't have enough money to have true experiences, or they don't have enough time to have true experiences, or whatever. Those people, we're going to build machines to solve the problems of their lives. And that to me is a really dangerous idea, because that breaks what I think is really important, which is our social contract with each other. And like you say, as someone who doesn't have the resources to have a real human therapist never gets a real human therapist. They don't even have the basics that's a machine, and then ultimately you get the human therapist. So that's a kind of our mental model of the escalation. When you've solved all the easy things, the hard thing goes to the human. Now, I'm not buying that particularly. I think it's going to end up being much more subtle than that. But that worries me. It worries me that we would give away our social contract to be there as accountable and responsible to each other. I think that's a very dangerous world, and that only the reality privileged, only the people with resources and time get to rely on other people. That seems a horrible place for us to go. So I think there's a real, there is a call to action here that's essentially we always end up back at this level of the individual, which is somewhat unsatisfying, but it's recognizing that we're part of this collection, and that the micro decisions that we make actually really do matter. Some of the way that you close off the book, I think, really speaks to the sort of core message here, which is it's not about put your phone down and have no phone days, do a digital detox, which I've always found completely and utterly unsatisfying as an answer. Totally useless. Like, don't even write the last chapter if that's all you can say. What you've really done here is make this much more granular, much more about what do we value and why do we value it, and let's project both backwards, right? Gen X, we're fantastic because we actually remember this.
We are the best generation, and totally underappreciated because we're small. Yes, we should be ruling the world. I'm just saying.
Yes,
totally. You're speaking to the converted here. We tell our kids all the time this, and they just roll their eyes.
Hey, there are older millennials who are constantly asking if we'll adopt them into the generation. I'm like, we have a process to decide. You can apply.
We have a process.
Yeah,
I'm not sure you qualify. There's a lot of formative experiences that you'd have to come up with.
Yeah, it probably involves spending 8 hours out on your own.
Yes, did you drink warm water from the hose in the summer? Like this is the beginning level of application.
Warm water from the hose.
Oh, my father caught me.
July in New Jersey.
Oh, but My father caught me doing that once, and then he scared me so much because he said, "Do you realize that I just had that in the bucket of weed poison?" I was like, ah.
That's what
So
your
I
immune
can't
system is for.
Exactly.
Anyway, back to the book. I love the framing that we need to project back to Gen X, best generation, and forward.
Yes.
What is it that and I don't want to say more mindful, but actually be really analytical. Be analytical about what we're losing, and so I think that the way you draw this all together is really powerful because it gives both at the same time a sense of individual agency and a I have to do this, a real imperative, but also the sense of me doing this could actually change things. It's not just an individual I'm disconnecting for now, and it's not just me against big tech. There's something here that gives a greater sense of personal agency, and I'm curious as to how you would characterize that yourself. I mean, you talk about with your sons, and we've got a ton of kids that we try, but probably failed. But we know that these experiences are changing, and how are you embracing that that value system in that sort of everyday way?
So it's funny because when I started researching technology, I was like, oh yes, take a digital Sabbath, have these, don't multitask. It seems so simplistic now, but back then actually some of those tools worked because the ubiquity of the technology pre-smartphone wasn't what it is now. We weren't completely saturated. Our public spaces weren't totally colonized by technology and screens. So it made sense to, strike a balance was useful advice. You're absolutely right. That doesn't work any longer. So I have taken to sounding like a slightly crazed, again, old lady shouting at clouds. But when people ask me, I said, you have to defend the human. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, every time something new is devised and sold to you as a better, more efficient, convenient, easier way to do something, look at where it places the human. What role do you have? What is it asking you to outsource in terms of your human skills? Is it trying to replace things that you already know how to do? And are you aware of that? Now, if you choose it knowing that, then you've made an informed decision. And no one reads the terms in service, but I kind of feel like that we should have our own internal terms and conditions, a list we go through before we adopt these new things, whether it's for ourselves individually, whether it's for our families, whether if you're an employer, if it's for your employees. And pushing back now is what we must do as a first principle, not as a final one, because the default is now always to accept the new technology, accept the mediated experiences better. We see these battles play out almost always. The most vulnerable populations are the ones who get experimented on. Children, the sick, and the elderly. And this is where you see the reality privilege idea really doing pernicious things already. And it was the only part of the book, actually, when I was writing about Mark Andreessen and his reality privilege scheme, that had to go through legal vetting, because I think the first draft I was so enraged when I read what he had said that I just started furiously, like that cat meme, on the internet, which is furiously typing. That was me. But I do think there are two things about that vision. It is widely shared. He articulated it very bluntly, but I think a lot of people in his orbit believe that would be a finer existence for those people because they've given up, as you say, on actually improving everyone's lives. They themselves that means that they sort of, the subtext there is that human contact is now a luxury good for the people who can afford it. And I don't want to live in a world where that's the case. But we do, depending on your educational background, your social status, your socioeconomic position, and where you live in this country, that's the case for some people, that human contact is a luxury good for them. They can't afford to pay for it anymore. And whether that's in healthcare or education, where the vision for AI in education is to have kids all in a room with their one-on-one tutor bots and maybe a monitor kind of, wandering around. And that is a vision of education. I don't think it's one Thomas Jefferson would recognize or praise. It's very different from having a human being sitting and working with you. And our technologists don't live that way, but they're telling us we should. So the contradictory advice they are giving The fact that they go and build their own private cities outside San Francisco where they will live with their human nannies and their human tutors and their human massage therapists and human chefs, while the rest of us are supposed to, eat ready-to-made meals and watch those elaborate meals being made on YouTube. That's an unfair world. And if they're going to design the virtual world that we all have to live in, they also control what we see, and they can persuade us to do one thing. They have a lot more. They have a lot of freedom, and the rest of us do not. And so, from a perspective of a small c conservative sensibility, that also worries me. Because if you have a free society, you need citizens who know how to exercise both the benefits and the responsibilities of that freedom. The technology is teaching us that we shouldn't have to be responsible for a lot of things anymore. We can outsource that to the app and to this and to that. That's where I think we do have to roll back some of those choices and say, no, it's my responsibility to go take care of my elderly neighbor in person when she needs help, because we're a community and that's what we do for each other. We show up for each other. If we stop doing that because we've bought into this conceit that an app can do it for us, we've gone way too far in the direction of treating each other like disposable objects or instrumentally as just relationships to be had when they're convenient and ignored when they're not. And that's not a society with very strong social bonds. And it's not a democracy that can flourish in those conditions because you're not raising virtuous citizens. You just can't in that environment. Boy, I went really dark there. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You describe it as contradictory, and I was about to jump in and say, I'd be stronger about it and call it hypocritical.
Yes.
In terms of the
that's
design.
the correct word.
So you're definitely in the preaching to the choir crowd. Maybe I could ask one more question, which is to actually flip it on its head, which is what gives you hope in this new world, and I use the word hope with the concept of with that sort of ingrained sense of rebellion, because sometimes hope is rebellious, right?
Yes.
So Gen X, yep. But what possibly gives you hope? What future could you imagine that would actually be a positive integration of these new technologies?
I love human beings and I love human nature, even though it can be a very terrible thing when it's expressed in bad ways. And I noticed that Silicon Valley talks a lot about humanity, but not about humans. And that's a distinction we should always notice. Because a lot of our technologists who are devising these tools for us don't actually really like people. In fact, they see us as a bundle of contradictions and bad behaviors that need to be steered and controlled and managed. I actually think that's exactly what gives me optimism about the future. And I'll give two examples. One is that more people raised in an environment where they were saturated by screens from a very young age, they feel like something is missing. They've developed a very fractured sense of self. My friend Nick Carr has written an excellent book about history of information. He calls it a mirror ball self. Like they're constantly trying to reflect off of what is right in front of them at the moment, but there's no center, there's no core. They know this. Human nature drives us to be risk-taking, curious people. And I think a lot of the technology that, particularly for younger generations, has flattened their world. And they're impatient. They're like, why am I unhappy? Why am I anxious? Why is all this? I have all these options, all these choices, all this entertainment, but I'm still feel like meh. That is a good thing, because that is a recognition of their human nature and its need to really test the limits and to learn new things and to get out in the real world and figure out these problems for themselves. That gives me hope. And you see it expressed in ways large and small. My favorite example is, my sons and their friends who are all in college now, and they're all broke because they're college students. They will go out to dinner and they want to have a conversation, a general conversation. Everybody puts their phones in the middle of the table. Whoever picks up a phone to check it during the course of the meal has to pay the bill. Otherwise, they'll each pay their own way. So nobody wants to pay this bill for 10 people, but that's a recognition of just how powerfully those devices draw their attention, and they want to set it aside so they can all be together. They have to choose that. They're lashing themselves to the mast to not be drawn to the technology. That gives me hope. And that same generation is coming into the workplace now and asking a lot more questions about the surveillance that their employers are doing of them. That is also healthy. That reminds me of young Gen Xers who are like, I'm not going to wear the uniform that way. I'm going to slash the sleeves and roll up the pant legs and do it my way. I mean, I'm still wearing the uniform, but they have My concern with that generation is that they have a healthy skepticism. I don't want it to curdle into nihilism, because if they care about nothing, that's the worst possible scenario. I want them to keep demanding answers and to ask all those questions. I have a lot of students I teach college students every summer in a seminar, and I always tell them to ask what's not on the menu. When you're given a new tool, what are they not offering you that you might want, that you might value, that might be necessary for you to do well in whatever this enterprise is? So they are skeptical, they are energetic, and I think the fact that we're seeing a bit of a return to certain little analog things, the resurgence of vinyl, people wanting to do more craft and things with their hands, these are all good. It takes a lot of little green shoots to offer a broader resistance, and I do think the fundamental principle for the next generation has to be to defend the human things, identify what is valuable about being a human that can't be outsourced, that shouldn't be made efficient or convenient, and find a way to value and valorize those things, because that's what we have to do now.
I love that.
Yeah, same.
And I feel like there's a second chat episode to this conversation, which is going to start off with the historical relevance of reality bites and just kind of run, right?
I am always, oh yes, no. And like middle child syndrome, which I also have, like, there's a whole thing about being a Gen Xer where, we're the middle child of the generations, and we have all of the characteristics of the middle child.
Yes, we are. Well, thank you so much for your scholarship and your book, as well as your Gen X reminiscence.
Thank you.
But no, this has been really a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, very much so.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much
Thank
for having
you.
me. Appreciate it.